This video will continue our overview of Chapter 9, Genres of the Old Testament, in the textbook Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. We come now to the wisdom genre. What follows will be some insights that have come to be meaningful to me. They do not all parallel the textbook, however. At the close of these, I'll follow with a few insights that are related to the textbook presentation. I commend to you this definition of biblical wisdom. Wisdom is the observation of order in the natural, social, and divine realms, so as to discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. Let's break this down. On each of the next few slides, you'll see that same definition produced up above with a few words in bold, which we'll concentrate on. So consider, for example, that wisdom involves observation. It is by observation that the sage, and we're referring to the authors of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job as the wise person or sage, so it is through observation that the sage receives revelation. Notice the distinction between that and the prophet. The prophet will receive a rather direct word from the Lord, sometimes in the form of a vision. Not so the sage. The sage rather looks at the world that God has made and observes, derives from that truths about how best to live in God's world. That is their way of deriving revelation. Not special revelation, but what we call natural revelation. Revelation that arises from observing nature. The second word is order, the observation of order. This is what the sage pays attention to as he engages in observing. For the sage recognizes that God designed the universe with predictable action-result consequences. When you think about it, this is the foundation of the scientific method. Scientific method says that as a person observes an action with a certain consequence, if that is repeatable, then it becomes something that you can rely on. So, for example, if you drop an anvil on your foot, it's going to hurt. If you do it a second time, it still hurts. Gravity's. So you learn that that's the outcome of dropping an anvil on your foot. It means that you're going to learn not to do that in the future. Hand on a hot stove, same thing. You learn that's something you shouldn't do. Why? Because there is a reliable consequence. It's an orderly universe. Now, the sage, as he makes observations about action and consequence relationships in the world, is not just about gravity or burns and heat, but rather he will deal in the realms of social relationships. What if I treat my neighbors like this? What if I regularly trust someone that I really don't know? What will be the outcome of that? Social relationships and also relationships with God. We're highlighting here the words choice and path, so as to discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. The sage believes that a person has the power to choose. Life is not fully determined. So that if you provide information to someone, they can incorporate that information and consequently make a choice about what direction they want to go. Path. Life is a route to be traveled. It is a way. It extends over time. And the way that you travel is a result of choices you've made in the past. Also, this idea of way reminds us that we're tending towards a destination. We're not simply talking about heaven or hell here. The sage would say, a choice you make today will influence where you wind up tomorrow. So if you choose friends that lift your sense of ambition and good values in life, you will wind up taking on some of those traits, and you will become, as your life's road unfolds before you, you will become like them. Converse can also be true, right? Finally, this word happiness. To discern by rational choice the path most effectively leading to happiness. What we have here is something much richer than simply a notion of feeling good. It is an eminently desirable destination. It is something that has durable well-being, not just a momentary feel-good experience. That's what the sage would want us to know. Happiness is not a real good choice. There's a Hebrew word, ashrei, that has the sense of the summum bonum, the very best after which one might aspire. So once again, notice the definition that's been recommended to you. Wisdom is the observation of order in different realms: natural realm, social realm, divine realms. Why observe this? So that we can derive some good counsel from those observations, and thereby discern by making a choice, rational choice, a thoughtful choice, to travel in the path most effectively leading to the most worthwhile life possible. Next, consider how the sage conceives of God. Now, we want to keep in mind the Israelite sage is a member of the Israelite covenant community. It's not as though he's some free wheel out on the perimeter who has no respect whatsoever for the covenant and for ceremonies and rituals that grow out of a rich relationship with God. It's not as though he's foreign to that. He doesn't talk about that. But that's not to suggest that he's uninterested. It's simply that there are other people in the community that'll take care of that, that will teach the people about that. You have the priests and the Levites. You have, they are the ones that will guide the nation in that. So he is not anti that kind of a covenant-informed relationship with God. It's just not his category. He's not responsible to push that information forward. So what is the picture of God that the sage innately tends to default to, or that he feels it's his responsibility to make sure that others are aware of this aspect of God as well? It would be this, that God is the author of cosmic order. In a word, the sage's favorite attribute of God is that he is creator. Not simply that he made things and it was chaotic and he didn't like it and he walked away. No, he made things, and what he made sense. What he made was orderly. There are seasons that come one after another. There are plants that produce seeds that produce more of those plants. Not only this in the natural realm, but in the realm of persons relating to other persons. Then the sage derives from his notion of God's creation of an orderly universe the sense of justice. Justice in the form of a confidence that God is an orderly God, has made the universe so that good actions will eventually bring good benefit to the persons perpetrating them, and bad actions will eventually bring bad consequences to their perpetrators. In a word, we call this retribution. Now let's talk about different kinds of wisdom writing that we find in the scriptures and how to interpret them. Within the book of Proverbs itself, we have two major sorts of sayings. Now, they are not collected, chapters 1 to 14 has this kind, and chapters 15 to 31 has another. No, they're mixed together. But scholars of wisdom literature notice that sometimes a proverb will issue a very plain command. It will contain an imperative. Other times, there is no imperative present. We'll talk about the second kind. First, we call these sayings, and you'll see that we distinguish them from admonitions or instructions. So sayings, by nature, they are the ones that don't have a command. How then to interpret them? we want to interpret them through the mind of the sage, and what he's thinking is these are usually reliable, but not always. In other words, a statement about life that issues from the sage is not the same as a promise that we find in other parts of Scripture. Rather, he's observed life and says usually it works like this. But there are some conditions which can overturn these typical cause-effect scenarios that he sees in life. Here's an example then. The first one on the page shows something that should normally take place. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on the one who starts it rolling. Implicit there is that you're rolling a stone to harm someone else. And he says, you know what? Eventually it's going to come back and land on you, cause damage to yourself. Similar, digging a pit, the idea is you're trying to trap someone. And he says, you're going to fall into it. Notice, by the way, this is retribution, isn't it? Notice that it has no command. It's no imperative. It's simply describing a principle that the sage has observed to largely be true in life. What I'm suggesting is an anti-proverb, that is a saying which doesn't seem to hold to this idea of orderliness and predictable retribution, is in 21:31. The horse is made ready for the day of battle, but the victory belongs to the Lord. Okay, the principle here is we would expect that anyone making due preparation, thoughtful preparation for battle, such as making sure their horse is in good health and perhaps has whatever protection and is well fed, so the horse is made ready for the day of battle, you would expect the second half to say, consequently, a person taking care of that war horse is going to win a battle. But instead we find a different statement. But victory belongs to the Lord. That's to say that even though you might make thorough war preparations, if God has in mind a different outcome, doesn't matter how prepared you are, God is going to make sure his sovereign will comes about. We're turning now from those sayings which have no imperative to instructions, also known as admonitions. What characterizes these is simply the fact that they include an imperative, such as you see in 22:22 of Proverbs. Do not exploit the poor because they are poor. Notice the command. Actually a prohibition. Don't exploit them because they are poor. In case you're wondering how that sounds in Hebrew, this particular one has a fair amount of alliteration and similar assonance, similar sounds coming through it. Al tigzal dal kidalhu. Al is do not. Tigzal, exploit. Dal is poor. Ki is because. Dal, poor. Hu is him, because he is poor. So again, we have the prohibition. How should we interpret this? Well, we should take advantage of the advice that's given there and live according to it. So far we've dealt with short sayings, whether they have imperatives in them or they have no imperatives. There's another sort of wisdom, the longer compositions. And so within chapters 1 through 9 are a number of fairly clearly self-evident poems. And so what we're talking about here, a poem, or as it says on the screen, a wisdom speech, it means a longer connected teaching, not just isolated sayings. How to interpret them? Read over the speech, read over the poem, and then figure out what the point is. What is the large point? And then take that to heart. So far we've concentrated on straightforward wisdom. We call it conventional wisdom. It's predominantly in the book of Proverbs. This is not the only kind of wisdom that we find in the Bible. The other kind we call speculative wisdom over against conventional. Speculative wisdom. Why do we call it speculative? Because in this case, the inspired wisdom writers are thinking about a problem. They're speculating. How can we make sense of a particular paradox or dilemma? And primarily, it is this. Do you remember how important is orderliness? And the extrapolation of orderliness is retribution. Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to when people do bad things. Well, what should the wise person understand when that is turned on its head, turned upside down? Speculative wisdom is when the wise person is wrestling with the problem of good things happening to bad people and bad things happening to good people. Case in point, Job, an extremely good person, and yet extremely bad things happen. This is our classic speculative wisdom book. Ecclesiastes also deals with this. How then should we interpret and what can we apply to our lives from Job and Ecclesiastes? First, here are books of God's inspired Bible to us that make clear life is not always fair. That's important to realize. Next, we should interpret the minutiae, the little elements of the book, little pieces, in light of the whole book message. So, for example, within Job, if we encounter small bits of it, we want to remember the large message that God's reasons for suffering are sometimes not humanly comprehensible. Nevertheless, God remains reliable. You may remember in Job how the accuser, the adversary, was making, in essence, a wager with God, saying, I think the only reason people follow you is because of retribution. They are doing things that make you happy because they know good benefits are going to follow. They don't follow you. They don't worship you, God, because of who you really are. It's just because of your payout. You've got a good payout reputation. And God says, well, have you considered Job? Let's take away all the payout and let's see if he still honors me. And Job then is God's, in a sense, a champion. Classic example one, that there are people in the world who will still worship and honor God, will not give up on God, even when the benefits stop coming. Powerful message. Ecclesiastes, one way to summarize the large message for Ecclesiastes is this: life makes only limited sense until lived in response to the Creator. To take time to read over what the authors of Introduction to Biblical Interpretation say concerning wisdom literature. You'll see a few of the points I've made reinforced there, and then they'll add some others. In closing, I'd like to draw your attention to page 505 towards the bottom. They have a heading that reads, How to Write a Structural Outline. I'd like to lift out a few points here just to reinforce things that you've already been trained in the course to this point. Bottom of 505. In the table, step 1, delimit your text. Where does it begin and end, and why? This is something that we've called boundaries. So you can see that's a standard feature. Step 2, identify its subgenres. At first glance, what seem to be the main sections? And then be attentive to what genre. Is it narrative? Is it poetry? Is there some genre within narrative or poetry, as you'll learn in the next, as we talked about in the previous chapter on poetry. Next page. I would encourage the various steps, but especially down in step 7, interpret your outline. What do you observe in the outline? Second bullet, what comes first and what comes last? It's worth giving thought. Why do the lead descriptions of a story or the lead principles of a poem Why do they come early? And then what thought does the author or the poet leave you with at the end? This can be very influential for detecting what the theme is. Third bullet, are there any patterns you're used to watching for these repetitions or restatements? And other literary devices such as metaphors. Second to the last bullet, trace the flow or logic of the text. Read through it, paraphrasing how each part develops its thought or message. This is what you've been developing, the skill you developed through the logical outlines. Paraphrasing it, looking for the logic. How does the thought flow through it, and how does it develop? Not just isolated pieces, but how do they link together and develop a sense of movement? Detecting that momentum can be immensely valuable as you try to get the pulse of the passage. And that will help us with the message and also the delivery of the message to impact ourselves and those that have been entrusted to our care. They have an example of a text that they work through, and I'll leave it to you to look that over. So we've seen, as far as the Old Testament is concerned, genres of narrative, law, poetry, prophecy, and wisdom, keeping in mind that prophecy can contain a lot of poetry, as can wisdom. Wisdom is quite universally expressed as poetry. But it's a different kind of poetry than, say, the Psalms, and that's primarily what they were concentrating in step number 3. So we want to be responsible interpreters, and that means watching what kind of genre we are working in and then interpreting according to the principles of that genre. Again, I commend to you this chapter as a reference for later work in your ministry involving interpretation of Scripture.